No worries.
All right, thank you. Hi there. Sorry, I think I might have accidentally
You
muted
muted yourself.
myself.
Yeah.
There you go. That's always going to happen. Curses of COVID and trying to stream live. But look, we're here joined with Jonathan Starks, who's going to be speaking to us about the Hindmarsh Landcare Network Initiative, the Project Hindmarsh. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to present. So, yeah, I'm going to talk about how Project Hindmarsh began, what it's all about, what some of our achievements have been, and what that all means, and of course, the bright future ahead that we have. So, just to paint a little bit of a picture, um, talking about Victoria's Wild West here. So, sandwiched between the big desert in the north and the little desert region in the south, and pressed against the sometimes hostile frontier border of South Australia, Victoria's Wild West encompasses a contrasting landscape of fertile plains and harsh deserts, oases and salt swamps, rivers and creeks which can rage then run dry, lakes and wetlands which can teem with life then turn to dust, and 40 plus thousand years of continuous occupation by the Wodjabolic peoples. This is Victoria's Wild West. So when Europeans arrived in the 1840s, they cleared most of the fertile plains, dammed, channeled and drained most of the waterways and wetlands, and in doing so disrupted many of the natural ecological processes. But this part of Victoria is also one of the most productive cereal growing regions of Australia. This is the Wimmera wheat belt. But it is also a fragmented landscape and in some respects an ecologically dysfunctional landscape. So back in the 1990s, a small community group, the West Wimmera Tree Group, reminisced about the days of old when the big desert and little desert were joined by native vegetation, and they wondered about what had been lost in the last century and a half. And what you do when you've lost something? Well, you go looking. So after some discussion, the West Wimmera Tree Group decided to conduct a survey of the remnant vegetation that was present along roadsides between the two desert regions. But given the size of the task, they needed to pay someone to do it. So they employed this hippie environmentalist who, yes, he had long hair and he drove a combi van and rode a bicycle, and employed him to map all the vegetation communities along the roadsides in the West Wimmera and Hindmarsh Shires. Going above and beyond the call of duty, he ended up surveying not just the main roads, but all the roads, the tiny little one chain roads, the two chain and three chain roads, thousands of kilometres in all. And the result of this incredible effort is what we've now called the famous Scalzo map. So this is where it all began. Now, this was 1997, and 1997, of course, predates all the fancy mapping and GIS software that we have. So this Scalzo map was a large piece of paper with all the vegetation overlays, not just a click away, but clear pieces of plastic with texture lines drawn on it for all the different vegetation communities that he had mapped. And it showed a whole series of dots and dashes along the roadsides that he'd covered. And when this map was shown to a group of locals comprising the West Wimmera Tree Group, Greening Australia, local naturalists, and the recently elected mayor of the Hindmarsh Shire, they were all sitting around someone's lounge room having a glass of red or three. It was pointed out that there was about 100 kilometres of gaps in native vegetation along those roadsides. And if those gaps could be replanted, we could end up with 2,000 kilometres of biolinks across the landscape. Well, the group didn't need any more convincing, and so began Project Hindmarsh, the big desert to little desert biolink. So the initial focus of Project Hindmarsh was on roadsides to join all those dots and dashes between the two deserts. Raising the money, sourcing the plants, getting the permits and permission is a whole other story. But from the outset, Project Hindmarsh was always designed to be a broad community project, bringing volunteers from city areas, from country areas, together to plant the trees. Over 400 volunteers, many from Melbourne, descended on the small Wimmera town of Nil, taking over the Little Desert Lodge for that first Project Hindmarsh planting weekend way back in 1998. That was last century. A huge effort by all those involved in those first few years saw the last link in that connection planted in 2001. The then Federal Minister for Environment, Senator Robert Hill, was invited up for the occasion and planted the final tree. And an interesting little anecdote, the small child that's kneeling there with Senator Hill asked him, "How many trees have you planted, mister?" And he said, "One." And the little boy said, "Well, you're going to have to plant a lot more than that or you won't be invited back." So I think that's a pretty funny story. So after we completed the connection on roadsides, the focus then shifted to planting areas of private land. But for this to exceed, it was vital that Landcare build strong relationships with the farming community. HLN, or Hindmarsh Landcare Network, had farmers on our board of management, and their guidance and support was and still is vital to the success of Project Hindmarsh. So the slide you see there shows a 26 hectare planting site in the paddock of a farmer near the Big Desert. Now, these landholders were keen to do something to help the environment, and they took the northern end of one of their paddocks, that's a 300-metre strip, out of production and gave it over to trees. And this was in 2006, and 2006 was the middle of the millennium drought. And so although there's a bit of a green paddock you see above that planting area, this was actually hard times, and they were able to give up this land. That was their connection to revegetation and to the environment. So this photo looks like it was taken from a drone. It was actually taken from a cherry picker that was amongst a group of yellow gum in the middle of that paddock. And so they were revegetating all around that little remnant clump, and therefore able to connect that clump through the vegetation to other communities along roadsides. And 26 hectares of production is a huge sacrifice for any landholder to make. Project Hindmarsh continues to work with landholders, planting shelter belts, fencing off and enhancing remnants, or revegetating new areas. Over 200 volunteers participated in Project Hindmarsh in that year in 2006. But Project Hindmarsh planting weekends have always been big social events. They say a Landcare army marches on its stomach, and so providing a healthy lunch out at the planting sites, sitting down and having a chin wag with friends is all part of the fun. For many years, Project Hindmarsh descended on Little Desert Lodge near Nil. The whole place was booked out for the weekend. Some people camped, some people booked out rooms at the lodge, others brought their Winnebagos or their camper trailers, or even just slept in their cars. People gathered from far and wide, from many different backgrounds, all sharing a common interest. Bringing city and country together became the motto of Project Hindmarsh. Engaging the traditional owners of the land on which we plant has always been an important part of Project Hindmarsh. We have invited local elders to give welcome to country and acknowledgement of country at our planting weekends. Engaging traditional owners is an important education aspect. If you look at the table behind there, you'll see some artifacts, a woven basket and some possum skins. And it was a really important opportunity that we had here to educate the volunteers that had come along and ourselves about that connection to country there. So we may be planting on roadsides and farmland or in remnants, but we're also planting on Wodjabollock land. We also engage our local land council to undertake Aboriginal cultural heritage assessments of our planting sites to ensure we do not disturb culturally sensitive sites and to help us appreciate that connection to country. And we have actually found some really interesting things. We found artifact scatters, mid-ins, scar trees, including one really interesting scar tree, which was like a toehold tree. It was like a ladder cut into a leaning trunk that was found by the cultural heritage assessors. We've also been blessed to have a great relationship with the Nil Karan refugee community. They have joined our volunteers at all the recent community planting weekends. For the last 2 years, the Karan community have catered for our Saturday evening meals. So everyone has enjoyed a fabulous traditional Karan curry that's been on offer. These have now become a much anticipated part of our planting evening celebrations. The involvement of local communities, the Melbourne and regional volunteers, the engagement of local businesses, Victorian state government, state and federal Landcare, and the philanthropic support we receive are all vital parts of what has made Project Hindmarsh such a success. But there is another measure of success, and really the whole basis on which the Big Desert to Little Desert BioLink was founded. Does all this revegetation actually make a difference to biodiversity? Are we connecting landscapes, or are we just planting trees and having a good time? Each year, millions of dollars are spent on Landcare and other revegetation and restoration programs. Millions of volunteer hours go into supporting such projects across the state. We can easily measure outcomes such as how many trees, shrubs, herbs and grasses we put in the ground, how many hectares are planted, the cost, the volunteer hours, etc. But how do we measure those environmental outcomes? How do we find out whether all this effort is actually making a difference to biodiversity? Well, we can look at an example at one of our planting sites. So this is Snake Reserve. Snake Reserve is a 757 hectare reserve near Dimboola owned by the Trust for Nature. It was purchased in 2002 in a pretty degraded, weedy state. A Snake Reserve Committee of Management was formed, and they embarked on a long-term restoration and revegetation program, of which Hindmarsh Landcare Network has been a part of. In 2003, a 12-hectare section of former farmland was planted out with a mixture of trees and shrubs to match the adjacent remnant plant communities. That's that area you can see in the slide there. In the middle, have a look, there's a lone bull oak, which for birds actually acts as a stepping stone for birds crossing that landscape, which is otherwise just bare of native vegetation. So this area was planted, say, in 2003, and in that slide 1 year on, it really just shows it's still just lines on the ground, it's bare with the lone bull oak there. Jump forward to 2006, and little has actually changed. This revegetation is now 3 years old. The plants are barely out of the top of their guards, and there is still a lonely bull oak in the middle. By 2009, it's now 6 years old, and things are starting to get interesting. The trees and shrubs are beginning to develop canopy. Those dots are getting bigger. Trees and shrubs, they're still roughly the same height, around 2 meters tall, and so there's no layering in the vegetation. The canopy of the shrubs and the trees are still around the same height, and there's not a lot of leaf litter that's accumulated on the ground, and that bull oak is still standing out. Then we can do a fast forward to 2017. The vegetation now is 14 years old, and the vegetation canopy is closing up. The trees have outgrown the shrubs, and the revegetation is developing structural layering. So you're getting the shrubs and then the trees, and on the ground they're accumulating litter. The shrubs and the trees are flowering and seeding, and second generation plants are now growing. The planted trees have actually caught up into that bull oak now, and it's now just lost in the crowd. If you look at that same area from the ground at the same time, this 14-year-old vegetation, you can see that you've got the shrub layer there, and the trees are getting a lot taller there. So how can we find out whether this vegetation is actually having any ecological function? Well, I began monitoring birds as part of a region-wide monitoring program of that site, and I started monitoring that site in 2008. Birds, as you probably know, are good indicators of environmental condition. They're active during the day. They occupy quite a range of ecological niches. So you've got birds that forage on the ground, birds that forage in amongst foliage or under bark or up in the canopy. And we do know a fair bit about birds. So surveying birds over time can give a great insight into the ecological function of an area. So what I did was I measured birds using the revegetation in a 2-hectare area centered around that bull oak. And I also measured those that were flying over the site or were perched in that lone bull oak. So this slide here just shows a quick graph of the results of what we've found out. The green bars are the number of birds that have been using the vegetation, and the blue is those that have been flying over or have actually been just perched in that bullock on their way through. And as a quick summary, the diversity of birds, as you can see, increased quite steadily with the age of the reveg, peaking when the reveg was around 10 years old. That's that 2013-14 bar. And also the proportion of birds that was using the revegetation rather than flying over steadily increased. Species which were once recorded flying over are now recorded using the reveg to forage or to move through. As the plants grew, so did the ecological function. So to answer that question, does revegetation create habitat? Well, yes, it does, but it's not quite the whole answer. Comparisons of that site with intact remnants show that it's still not quite functioning at the same level. But to be fair, this vegetation was planted, nearly 20 years ago now. We've learned a lot more about how to diversify revegetation. It's also very young. It's still only 16, 17 years old. There's no hollows, of course, because the trees are too small. Without nest boxes, you're not going to get any hollows to support birds. So we can conclude that yes, revegetation does create habitat, it does increase biodiversity, and it does connect landscapes. And importantly, Landcare revegetation programs connect people and connect people to the land. So yes, the hippie was right. Revegetation does provide connectivity. Just looking at the sites that we've planted over the now 24 years of Project Hindmarsh, we've been very successful in connecting the big desert and the little desert. We've planted over 2 million trees since 1998, created over 1,000 hectares of new habitat, and provided huge biodiversity benefits across the region. To the thousands of our volunteers who have supported Project Hindmarsh for 24 years now, who have invested themselves in our vision, who have gotten their hands dirty and connected to the land, to country, you have all contributed to a lasting legacy in Victoria's Wild West. I just want to thank everyone, all our project partners and supporters, and our volunteers who have helped make Project Hindmarsh such a success. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that fascinating presentation, Jonathan. That's amazing to see how much has been achieved and what you've accomplished in terms of bringing back biodiversity to the region and the contributions there. It's really fascinating. Now we just got a little bit of time for some questions. If anyone does have a question, please feel free to drop them into that question box and we'll endeavor to answer as many as we can. Now for the first question for you, comes from Stephen, and Stephen asks or is interested to know if you've considered monitoring changes in water retention, microclimate changes.
So look, we haven't, and it is a good point, because one thing that we are, I guess, looking more and more at now is what effect revegetation has on soils. So not only that carbon accumulation of soils, but even just the soil mycorrhizal fungi, all of which, of course, help that water retention in soils. So it is an area that we would like to move into. I haven't looked at it yet, but yeah, no, it's a very good point.
Fantastic. Now we have another question that's come through from Ella, and Ella would like to know what's next for the Project Hindmarsh.
So look, we want to continue to connect the big desert and the little desert regions. We are still wanting to run projects. We are working with state government and with Landcare groups and community groups to continue to plant. We've pretty much only going to be doing areas of vegetation on private land now. It's getting harder to plant on the Crown land, so that a lot of those roadsides were done a long time ago, but still building those healthy relationships with landholders and continue to revegetate and join those dots.
Fantastic. So we've got time for one more question, and we've had two people coincidentally drop in similar questions at the same time. So I'll ask you both of them. And the sentiment is, in essence, what do you think keeps volunteers coming back year on year? Do you think that it's birding and habitat for birds, or plants and plant species? What do you think keeps them coming back?
Well, I think just that sense of participation, knowing that they're part of this big picture. This is a long-term picture. You can visit sites that they've planted years ago and see those little plants that they put in the milk cartons are now, big shrubs or tall trees. And just knowing that you're part of a big project. It's the social atmosphere of gathering as like-minded people in a hall, after planting, just getting out there and getting your hands dirty. All of these things, I think, are just what our volunteers enjoy about it and what keeps them coming back. Yeah.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for that presentation. It was truly fascinating and so inspiring to see all the amazing work that you've accomplished. Thank you so much for that.
Cheers. Thanks.
Thanks. All right, everyone. So that is the cessation of our second presentation today. We've now got about a 45-minute break for lunch. As much as I love sitting here, I also love food, so I'm going to have to run away for a minute, but we'll be back in no time with another 3 presentations today. So please tune back in about 45 minutes for our next talk, which will be Rebecca Birch from Nature Explorers. Thanks so much. We'll see you soon.